In this lecture, we're looking at Calvin's conversion and his exile. And we've come at this point in the story to the point where Calvin, a young humanist and a man who is attempting to ingratiate himself within the French Reform movement, has, like so many of the humanists in his day, come to the realization that he can attempt to explore the intricacies of the biblical faith from within France. And we said in our last lecture that, unlike Luther, men like Calvin were not yet being put to the test. They were not yet being put to the question. There was no here I stand moment for them, and there was no opportunity for those in the Catholic Church to press those who were seeking reform from within to either leave or to conform. And the importance of Calvin's conversion is not only that this is the moment when he becomes fully a Protestant, but also because Calvin, for the rest of his life, will have things to say about those who attempt to hide their faith and stay within the Catholic Church long after the separation between Protestant and Catholic has occurred. And this is unique for Calvin. Luther doesn't really go into this during his life, at least not to the extent to which Calvin does. But Calvin says two sort of general things about those who are within the Catholic Church after the 1530s. First and foremost, most people forget the fact that Calvin was actually appreciative of the fact, at least at the lay level, that there were churches, particularly in France, that were preaching the gospel and that had conformed themselves to the biblical faith. Calvin actually speaks quite positively of these folks and of these churches. He has quotes here and there where he says that there were numerous churches and numerous individuals who, for whatever reason, were locked within a Catholic area who had true faith. Calvin, in other words, knew that to conflate or to equate one's denominational or church allegiance to true faith was simply to repeat some of the problems of the Middle Ages, where one's assurance was based on one's proximity to the papacy. Calvin does not charge that anyone who just happens to be Catholic in his own day is by default someone who is a repugnant, recalcitrant Catholic who is trying to earn their salvation or something like this. He doesn't go pugilistic with these people. Rather, he speaks with grace, and he encourages them to explore their faith more. And really, this is a signal of something that both Luther and Calvin and a number of other Protestants do. Usually, some of the real harsh rhetoric that we see in Luther or Calvin against the Catholic Church is not targeted at the laity. You will almost never, in fact, I have never found a case myself, where Luther or Calvin will excoriate those who are at the lay level. Rather, what you often see is Luther or Calvin, whenever they're being quite sharp, or in some cases when they're being quite feisty with those who are Catholics. In just about every case, indeed in the vast majority of cases, their focus is on the clergy or on the establishment within the Catholic Church, those who are teaching people that penance is the path to salvation. In other words, Calvin does speak very positively of the problem of being within a church that is faithful to the scriptures, or yourself believing truthfully in the work of Christ for your salvation, in the Protestant sense of justification by faith. Calvin, from his own backdrop, from the world that he came from, is more than sensitive to that issue of accommodation. That being said, though, the second thing that Calvin does when he talks about those who are within France or within other parts of Europe who are hiding their faith, perhaps for the sake of material advantage, Calvin has another tone of voice and another thing to say about this problem. In fact, Calvin invents a new word: those who stay within the Catholic Church for the sake of their own comfort or for the sake of not losing their way of life. Those who know that they do not believe in the Catholic Church, but yet hide it fully. Calvin will call them Nicodemedians. Well, the name Nicodemedians for Calvin comes from the man Nicodemus in the Gospels, the man who is part of the establishment of the rabbinic classes within first century Judaism, who was intrigued by Jesus and who came to him in the dark of night and climbed a tree in order to gaze upon him or to hear some of his teachings. And Calvin finds an analogy in this to perhaps some of his old friends back in France, those who were part of the intelligentsia or those who were part of the university system. Calvin is saying, you know that you are Protestant. You are hiding your faith. You're not merely conflicted, and you're not merely unable to leave. Rather, you don't want to because it will inconvenience you, he will say. In other words, Calvin will also be sensitive to those cases where people don't want to convert or don't want to leave for their own idiosyncratic reasons. And I think, as we'll see in this lecture, that actually creates a bit of a microcosm as to who Calvin is. Because as Calvin converts, he actually does not rush off from France at first light in order to make his way to Protestant cities. There is some evidence, and historians have made much or made little of this, but there is some evidence that Calvin is conflicted for a period of time after his conversion, at least for about the span of 6 to 12 months. He doesn't rush off quickly. Well, let's tell the story first before we get to that point. In the fall of 1533, we know that Calvin converted. All of his work, all of his biblical exegesis, all of his studies, as well as his sort of slow, plodding way of thinking through just about anything. And that really is Calvin's way of life. He's not quick to temper or quick to write. He's a very methodical man, you might say. And if you just ever read the Institutes, you'll see that care and concern on display. Well, in the fall of 1533, he converts. He gives us actually two somewhat different stories about this. A recent biography of Calvin's, in fact, actually alleges that Calvin gives two different stories of his conversion. And personally, I don't go there. I don't find these stories to be entirely antithetical to one another. But Calvin does give just two accounts of his conversion. We'll start with the more popular one. In 1557, Calvin published his Psalms commentary. And Calvin on the Psalms is actually where he's at his best. You'll recall that Luther's 1535 Galatians commentary is considered to be one of his best, one of his most poignant moments in his writing. Well, for many, it's the Psalms for Calvin. Calvin handles the wide range of human emotions and the ups and downs of life that are on display in the Psalms with enormous sensitivity and a real deft hand in terms of his exegesis. Well, in the preface to this work, Calvin talks about his conversion, and he says a couple things about this. First of all, he does indicate that as a young man in France, he was, quote, too obstinately devoted to the superstitions of popery. Now, trying to determine specifics as to what he means by this is a lost cause. But I find in this an allusion to his earlier days as a humanist. It doesn't have to mean that he's attracted to the superstitions of popery in the sense of worship only. Rather, what he's saying is he was attracted to the entire system, the entire orbit of the medieval Catholic Church. And that fits his personality when he's writing his commentary on Seneca. Here's a man who wants comfort, he wants prestige, and even though he seems, in later life, to comment that there were elements in him that were having issue with the Catholic system, he says that he was actually quite slow to be drawn to the faith. And he refers to his conversion, and he says that it was a, quote, subtle conversion. Now, Calvin never really puts a word out of place. Subtle conversion here, most historians take to mean that it wasn't an overnight eureka Luther in the Tower experience for Calvin. Subtle conversion here doesn't mean subtle in the sense of subtlety as we use the word today more often, as in someone is speaking subtly, they're kind of hiding it. Rather, subtle here means more like slow, more like the whisperings of the Holy Spirit in his ear, these kinds of images. But Calvin goes on, he admits that he was actually more hardened to the things of God or to the gospel itself than might have been expected. Now, I think this is important to understand Calvin. I think while on the one hand, he is a humanist and he's leaning towards biblical theology, and he's learning things about the classical view of things, and he has some critiques for the ways that scholastic theology and the Catholic system had arranged their doctrines and had practiced their faith. But notice, in a very short paragraph, Calvin twice has commented that he was slow to convert, that he was hardened of heart. And I think what this says about Calvin is that he's admitting here late in life, just a number of years before his death, that as a young man, he cared more about perhaps himself, cared more about the things of his career, and was thoroughly ingrained within the Catholic Church, such that it took him some time to thaw. And this is an enormously important contrast between Luther and Calvin. Far from something holding him back, Luther was actually growing dim and cold to the monastic lifestyle. He was having troubles with it, and he was seeking answers, and his pretty dramatic conversion or his pretty dramatic coming to the Reformation breakthrough, therefore, was a catalyst for Luther for all of the years that came after, and then with the posting of the 95 Theses and so on. Calvin isn't coming from that world. He's not already questioning and doubting things. He's trying to climb the ladder, climb the rope of success. And it's important to realize also, a number of Calvin's friends and colleagues from his humanist days did not convert. They remained in France. They continued on in their studies and in their teaching. And so Calvin, in some ways, went on by himself and left friends behind. There is, in other words, this tension, this pull within Calvin as a young man in the 1530s, where he is not quite ready to give up and die to self, you might say, to use a biblical phrase, for the sake of his convictions. Or maybe it's that his convictions are growing, but he's kind of trying to hit the mute button on them. Still, Calvin's conversion occurs in 1533, towards the end of the year. Now, Calvin offers another account of his conversion, actually earlier in his life, and it's one that's often overlooked, which is why we're mentioning it second. And that is, in 1538, Calvin wrote a letter to Sadoleto. And we're going to look at this letter in more detail in a later lecture. But Sadoleto was an important figure who was attempting, while Calvin was in exile from Geneva, to woo the city magistrates and those in authority in Geneva to reconsider the Reformation and return. And Calvin's letter to Sadoleto is really more of a defense of why the Reformation was required and why the Protestants eventually left the Catholic Church itself. Well, naturally, in the context of that letter, in the context of his comments to Sadoleto about why the Reformation happened, Calvin transitions from broader, wider categories of Protestantism in general and why they had converted as a whole, to, with a little bit of rhetorical flourish, discussing his own conversion and the rationale why he had left the faith. Well, in this account, Calvin isn't quite as halting in his language about his conversion. He speaks more of a rather quick conversion. He speaks more rather of a quick moment when he decides to make the leap. He doesn't use the language of a subtle conversion. He uses rather language of a real slapdash quick conversion. Now, again, historians have said in this, well, maybe Calvin doesn't remember, or maybe he's just kind of ginning up the story, depending on the context. I'm not quite so cynical. I think what Calvin is doing is somewhat tailoring the story to two different contexts. But again, Calvin, when he describes his conversion as a subtle conversion, as I've already said, you don't have to see in that as a subtle decision-making per se. Rather, I think on the one hand, he's talking about the ongoing evolution, the slow process of how things are dawning on him that he is no longer Catholic. But on the other hand, in his response to Sadoleto, Calvin is more forceful, saying instead that when he did decide, it was fixed. He didn't simply fall slowly away from the faith and then forget where he had come from. Rather, at one point, he had actually come to a full decision, and he had decided to join the Protestant faith. Well, in any case, we're never going to quite know what Calvin is doing here fully, but there are people who wonder just what's going on here in Calvin's conversion. Well, how did this conversion lead to his exile? Well, you'll recall in our last lecture that in the context of the French Reform movement, the Sorbonne had essentially put its collective foot in its mouth. It had gone against Francis and the Parliament, who had ordered the university no longer to condemn books or individuals, and yet they had still done so for The Mirror of the Sinful Soul, which, as we saw in our last lecture, was actually written by the king's sister, Marguerite of Navarre. Well, all the way up until the 1530s, up until 1533, in fact, the Humanist movement had relatively free rein. Now, those who were conservative, those who were still within the Catholic Church and committed to it, were working to recover their standing before the king. Well, it actually came to a point where those humanists who had finally moved self-consciously towards a Protestant direction actually churned the tide through a bloodless act of what was perceived to be terrorism, which then churned the king fully once and for all on the Protestants. Well, the story behind this is that in 1533, again, right around the time Calvin converts, there was appointed a new university rector for the University of Paris named Nicolas Cop. Now, Calvin had some relationship with the Cop family. He had known some of the younger members of the Cop family, in fact. And so when Nicholas becomes university rector, even though he was not a theologian per se, in 1533, on All Saints' Day, Nicolas Cop preached a sermon at the Church of Mathurins, there in Paris. Now, notice the day, All Saints' Day. It's unclear, but it is technically the day after the posting, historically, of the 95 Theses. And whether or not Nicolas Cop knew this, and whether or not this was some of the instigation behind this, we'll never know. But Nicolas Cop mounts the pulpit, and he proceeds to preach on something that he calls Christian philosophy. Now, that's code word for a more Erasmian, humanistic way of dealing with biblical theology. It's code, in other words, of saying Protestant without really being Protestant, or at least being right there on the fence between the two boundaries. Well, Nicholas preaches on Christian philosophy, but he doesn't simply give the Erasmian line. Erasmus, of course, in 1525, had sided with the Catholic perspective on free will and grace, which, of course, had led Luther to publish The Bondage of the Will. So when Nicholas Cop talks about Christian philosophy, at this point, he knows the difference. Well, in his sermon, he actually gives a relatively quick synopsis of the Luther understanding of the law and the gospel. And the sermon was on Matthew 5:3, blessed are the poor in spirit. And there was a particular Lutheran position on this. You'll remember the theology of the cross for Luther. The idea that when we are poor, when we are meek, when we believe that we have nothing to contribute to our salvation, that in the sort of upside down logic of the gospel, having nothing and attempting nothing is exactly when Christ's work is counted in our favor. Well, Nicholas takes this line. He takes this position on Matthew 5:3. Not only that, but he actually uses Martin Bucer's translation of Luther on this. Bucer, of course, will be a powerful figure in Calvin's life in future years. And Bucer himself was somewhere between the Lutheran and the Reformed position, increasingly towards the centrist Reformed position. But he was pro-Luther, and so, not surprisingly, he had translated Luther's writings on Matthew. So here we have the university rector. Though not really a humanist himself, not a theologian in the fullest sense, he had mounted the pulpit and he had preached, essentially, a Lutheran doctrine of law and grace. Now, what was Calvin's role in this? Well, in Beza's Life of Calvin, he actually tells us that Calvin had written the sermon. And we're not sure if this is the case. We do know that after Calvin fled from Paris, his rooms were searched, and there was a copy of the sermon in his own handwriting, which could mean one of two things. Either he wrote it, and then Nicholas Cop had transferred it onto his own paper for the use in the sermon, or perhaps Calvin himself went the other way and he had copied Nicholas's sermon. We'll never know. But Beza says pretty conclusively that he believes that Calvin himself had written it. Well, as you can imagine, those who were part of the establishment, those who were Catholic, were incensed by this. Cop comes under fire, and before he is arrested, he has to flee to the city of Basel, where he fully converts over to the Protestant faith. Calvin himself is somewhat implicated. Now, Calvin is still a nobody, frankly, and he wasn't searched out in the aggressive sense of that word, but he was known to be a friend of Cop, and actually Calvin flees from Paris at roughly this same time. And for those in the establishment, fleeing was tantamount to a mission of guilt. Now, really, the end of the high watermark for these Protestant-leaning humanists was the following year in October, because some, and we're really not sure who, did not necessarily the wisest thing when it comes to engaging with the political order. The evening of October 17th, there occurred something that is known today as the affair of the Placards. And the affair of the Placards are somewhat hard to understand in our modern world. But essentially what happens is people wrote up these little placards, these little pieces of wood, very thin, really scraps, you might say. In the modern sense, it might be something like a small piece of paper or a poster. But they had these little pieces of wood, and on it, they wrote a number of things, but the most important of which was they defied and they condemned the Catholic belief in transubstantiation and the need for infused grace in the life of the believer. Well, in a Catholic country, it's bad enough to mock the Mass, but the importance of the affair of the Placards is that those who were posting this all around the city of Paris, at one point, snuck into the king's quarters and posted one on his bedroom door. Sort of the ultimate example of vandalism going on here. Except in this day and age, that's not interpreted as vandalism. Rather, it's interpreted as terrorism. You can imagine if the President of the United States were to wake up and open his door, and though the Secret Service were still on post, there was on the door something that was sort of condemning a practice of his. Well, you can imagine that is an act of terrorism, you might say, or an act of threatening something against the king's own person. To post something on the king's door is to say, somewhat aggressively, we believe this and we can get to you, man. Well, almost overnight, Francis I's protection of Protestant-leaning humanists evaporates. He is furious, and you can understand why. And as a result, there were enacted policies and procedures to seek out those who were Protestant or evangelical leaning within the humanist world, and to either flush them out or to leave. At one point, Francis gives around 6 months for those who were leaning towards the Protestant faith to either explain themselves or to conform. Well, again, that's really it for the evangelicals within the humanist world. It's all over. And so Calvin's conversion coincides within a calendar year, roughly, of the affair of the Placards. And so in 1534, sensing that there was trouble in the water, Calvin resigned his 2 benefices, that is to say, the money he was still drawing from the church back in Noyon for the sake of his well-being and for the upkeep of his life as a scholar. He resigns them, which again is a full break with the Catholic Church, and he flees. Well, Calvin flees to not first to Geneva, and not first even to the Swiss Protestant regions. Rather, he flees to the du Tillet library. And the du Tillet library is on the estate of the du Tillet family, with whom Calvin had some connection. And they had this really pretty extraordinary library full of all kinds of works, particularly of the patristics and of biblical humanism. It's kind of a geek's paradise for a guy like Calvin. Well, for a time, Calvin is uncertain what to do. He's not being sought out aggressively or personally, not like Nicholas Kopp at least. And he is actually here in the du Tillet library, somewhat comfortable. He has a library at his disposal, and he is a tutor for the children of the family. There does seem to be some sense in which he's not quite sure what to do. And again, this is why I described Calvin's conversion as halting or as uncertain. He knows he's not going back to Paris, but that doesn't mean he has to flee and become a Protestant reformer. Well, as he reads and as he studies, he becomes, again, more convinced of the implications of his conversion to the Protestant gospel. Around this same time, as we've mentioned before, Calvin goes and meets with Lefevre. And Lefevre and he, again, we don't know what they talk about or even what exact time they met, but it does seem to be that Lefevre, in his old age, encourages Calvin to consider the implications of his faith, and Calvin, as a result, is led increasingly to the realization that he is going to have to likely flee at some point to a Protestant city, where he will take part in the Reformation there. Well, eventually Calvin does make that decision. In 1536, Calvin decides that he is going to flee to the city of Strasbourg. Well, Strasbourg was where Butzer was, as well as others. And Calvin believed he was going to go there and continue the life of a scholar and a teacher. He wasn't, in other words, seeking to be a religious reformer. He was never, in his own mind at this time, another Luther who was going to start a reformation within a major city. Rather, he knew fleeing to a city like Strasbourg or to the Swiss cantons was a life of exile. Well, along the way, there were ongoing skirmishes and wars, as we've seen before, between Francis I's army and the armies of Charles V. And so the path to Strasbourg was actually blocked by some of these wars and some of these fights and these armies. And so Calvin is led through an alternative route, which took him to Geneva. And he arrives in Geneva, and he believes that he is simply going to spend the night and then carry on along the way to the city of Strasbourg. Well, while he's there, William Farel discovers that Calvin is in the city. And Farel approaches Calvin and asks him to remain in Geneva, where the Reformation was on sort of its first legs, just getting underway. And Farel calls for Calvin to help him there in the city. Calvin actually demurs, doesn't want to do this, says, no thanks. I'm on to Strasbourg and Butzer in the life of a scholar. At which point, Farel, in a very famous scene, actually upbraids Calvin and just blasts him. Sort of, how dare you reject the calling of God to help in the Reformation? You'd rather spend your time in the library? How dare you, he says, if I can paraphrase. Well, Calvin relents and he stays. And this says two things to us. First, we're going to see this kind of temper from Farel as we go forward. In fact, one of the things that gets Calvin kicked out of Geneva is his ongoing partnership with Farel. And Farel somewhat burns bridges pretty quickly, and Calvin's association with him is one of the roots of the reasons why Calvin is first kicked out of the city of Geneva. But Calvin does relent. Though he wasn't seeking it himself, when put to the question, he does relent, and he decides that he's going to stay in Geneva and work as hard as he can to help people understand the Reformation and the Protestant theology that Luther had started back in the 15 teens. That's it. Next, we're going to be looking at Calvin's Institutes, published at this exact same time, which would become the high watermark of anything that Calvin would publish, and it would become one of the most important books in all of the 16th century.